Sometimes it's good to be able to laugh at ourselves. It's only been in the past 20 to 25 years that the internet and email has been a widespread phenomenon. I am old enough to remember the early days. There wasn't as much coming at us from all directions because social media was slow getting started, with MySpace being one of the first major platforms. Due to the slow development initially, I don't remember hearing conversations about the differences between true and false information. Fake news didn't really become a widespread term until the 2016 presidential election, but more on that later. Let's go back to laughing at me for a minute. In the late 2000s, I used to get emails every month or so saying that I had won a lottery. Every time I received the notification that I had won, I would get a little bit excited. Imagine what I could do with some extra money, especially at that point in my life. More than once, I would share my good news with someone who would typically ask me a question that I experienced as such a bummer. The question was usually some variation of, did you submit your name or your email address for that particular lottery? My answer, of course, was always no. I didn't even know about it until I received the good news. At that point, the person would stifle a laugh and say, I don't think you can actually win a lottery that you didn't enter. Each time I would think of all the arguments against that way of thinking, which weren't many. It was probably true, and in an instant, my hopes would be dashed. Now, the part that makes me laugh at myself is how many times I had to go through that same scenario until I actually started ignoring the emails. Everything in me wanted this news to be true, so I left my logical thinking behind and was willing to enter into a world of magical thinking where I did win the lottery I never entered, or I was the lucky heir to an African princess who wanted all of her money to go to me, even though we had never met. We are at another critical juncture in history, and have been for a few years, in which being able to distinguish what is true and what is false can be a matter of life and death. Needing to know what is true is as old as time. Jesus was talking about it when he walked the earth, because even then there were false prophets and rulers claiming to be the Son of God. Last week we talked about the differences between the Apostle Paul, who was a Jew and a Roman citizen, and Jesus, who was a Jew but not a Roman citizen. Paul had way more protections and access and privileges as a Roman citizen than did Jesus, and that impacted how Paul saw and wrote and talked about the world. In the text that we read this morning in John chapter 8, we are once again hearing about the Jewish leaders who were used by the Roman Empire to extort information, money, you name it, from regular Jewish people who had no protections like Jesus. Jesus was teaching in the temple, and in particular in the treasury of the temple, and the Jewish leaders who had sold their souls to Rome in order to survive were confused by Jesus' teaching. At one point, earlier in chapter 8, they asked Jesus who he was. Jesus responded by saying, I am exactly who I said I was the first time you asked. I have been the same person since the beginning. Jesus then goes on to talk about how when those particular leaders talk about their father, they are talking about the Emperor Caesar, who claimed to be a god and the father of all. Reverend Jennifer Butler says, from the time of Caesar Augustus, the ruler in power when Jesus was born, Rome governed through what was known as the imperial cult, a totalitarian belief system that required subjects to worship Caesar as a god. In our text, Jesus tells the Jewish people who believed in him that they are truly his followers if they are faithful to Jesus' teachings. Jesus then says, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's a confusing text because of all of the subtext. We forget that Jesus is talking to the Jewish leaders who had already sold their souls to the Roman Empire for their own benefit. Though they believed in Jesus, they apparently did not practice his teachings. Instead, they obeyed the Roman ruler who could take away all that they had. They were, in essence, enslaved to the empire because of how dangerous it was to go against the empire. They make the argument that they are children of Abraham, and Jesus counters by saying they couldn't be, because if they were children of Abraham, they wouldn't want to kill Jesus because of his teachings. After a couple of rounds of this, Jesus explains clearly what he's talking about. Jesus tells them, if you knew the real God, you would know that I, Jesus, was sent from that God. And then Jesus tells them that the father they're claiming, meaning Caesar, is the father of lies and murder, and that there has never been truth in him. This entire argument is about who is telling the truth and who is lying, and how they can know the truth. What I find fascinating in this exchange is that Jesus tells them they can demonstrate that they're true disciples if they follow Jesus' teaching, and living that way will set them free. This text is not meant to be anti-Semitic. Instead, it's a text that's supposed to demonstrate how easy it is for religious people who should know better, particularly religious leaders, to get caught up in the lies of someone claiming to be a god or chosen or the real deal or whatever term you want to use, even though it's not true. So let's come back to the idea of fake news. You might be surprised to learn that the term was used as early as the 1890s, according to Wikipedia. But according to a BBC article, it was really in 2016 that term morphed from a description of a social media phenomenon to a journalistic cliche, and then even on to an angry political slur. According to the article, and I did check this article out to see if it was true, so I did verify this particular story. I figured I had to since I was preaching on this today. According to the article, BuzzFeed's media editor, Craig Silverman, noticed a weird stream of completely made-up stories coming out of one small Eastern European town in Macedonia called Veles. He and a colleague investigated, and just before the 2016 presidential election, they discovered 140 fake news websites that were pulling in huge traffic from Facebook. What they uncovered in their investigation was surprising. Because the young people in Veles knew the US presidential election was a popular subject, they made up news stories that were fake in order to generate traffic so they could make money through Facebook ads. People looked for well-trafficked sites and then paid for ads on those sites. So they could write a story and title it Pope Francis Shocks World and Endorses Donald Trump for President, and millions of people would go to that story, which then generated huge money for them in ads. The young people in Veles who were doing this weren't even necessarily interested in politics. They just wanted to make some fast money. This is where the phrase fake news really came from in the past several years. The article goes on to say, but within months, the sheer ubiquity of the phrase fake news had perhaps rendered the term meaningless. All sorts of things, misinformation, spin, conspiracy theories, mistakes, and reporting that people just don't like, have all been rolled into the term. When people begin to be unable to distinguish fake news from real news, the impact can sometimes be giving up and assuming that nothing at all is true anymore. Or the other part, which is everything you read is true. Journalists, thank goodness, have been committed to fact-checking and presenting people with corrections to false reporting or lies that are told outright. The hope, of course, is that we too will continue to do our own fact-checking and to reject the idea that we can no longer know if something is true or not. In her book, Who Stole My Bible? Reclaiming Scripture as a Handbook for Resisting Tyranny, Reverend Jennifer Butler says that observers of totalitarianism have noticed that truth dies in 4 modes. Butler says the first stage is open hostility to verifiable reality. In this phase, a leader simply presents lies as though they are facts. An example would be when former President George W. Bush told the world that Saddam Hussein was hiding nuclear weapons and then used that as the justification for the attack on and subsequent war with Iraq. Another example would be that in his first 3 years of office, former President Trump was found to have made false or misleading statements more than 15,400 times. The second stage of totalitarian destruction of truth is the use of endless repetition designed to make the fiction plausible and the criminal desirable. Examples of this were the former president's use of the phrases, build the wall or lock her up. The next stage of totalitarian development is magical thinking, or the open embrace of contradiction. An example of this was when the former president issued a statement after white supremacists descended on Charlottesville and killed 1 person and injured many others. The statement he issued said, "We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides." Only one side killed and injured people, but the statement made it seem otherwise. The fourth state in the loss of truth and slide toward totalitarianism is blind faith in the leader. This one is particularly dangerous because truth is no longer based on fact, but in whatever the leader says. In explaining how all of this happens, Butler reminds us that we have to be more discerning in the things that we accept as truth. Just because it's on the news or in print doesn't necessarily make it true. We can't do it with everything, but we can certainly choose some areas that seem important in terms of our discerning. For those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus, there is the additional responsibility to ensure that the Bible and the church and pastors are not being used to push false gospels and false gods on the masses. Butler gives the example during World War II of theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who on day 2 of Hitler's rule went on the radio and tried to warn German Christians that Hitler was not going to keep his promises of redemption, salvation, deliverance, and rebirth, all of which he claimed he could do himself. In fact, Bonhoeffer began referring to Hitler as the Antichrist so German Christians would understand that Hitler was a liar and pretending to be a savior. Despite his efforts, most Christian pastors and theologians pledged their allegiance to Hitler, which is how Hitler was able to control the German church. We are naive if we think that couldn't happen here in the U.S., even though we have historical records of this happening in other places. We must be willing to call out the antichrists and to call out the false gospels being peddled. With the new Republican Speaker of the House, we will have to work overtime to be sure we are naming the lies and stating the truth. With the new proposed ban on Palestinians, for example, how will we speak from our Christian faith to claim that no entire group of people should ever be banned and that it is ignorant to connect all Palestinians to Hamas, which is a terrorist organization? One of the helpful parts of Butler's chapter on knowing the truth is that she recognizes how difficult it is to sustain that effort over time. And she offers some spiritual practices to help us with this marathon effort. She suggests keeping the Sabbath, maintaining rituals, and showing compassion. Keeping the Sabbath is not just about going to church, but about the discipline of taking at least some time off every week from the water hose of news and screens. With handheld computers that we call cell phones, we have near constant input. And taking a Sabbath means taking a break from that input and doing some listening to God or to Spirit or even one's intuition. We listen in ways that can help us with balance, with clarity, with call. One of my regular practices is to go to the bird sanctuary to listen to what nature and the creatures in it is saying and doing. I'm learning to listen a little differently because it's not a world that I know or that I control. Maintaining rituals includes celebrating communion. It includes praying at certain times of the day or in certain ways. It can include a ritual like lighting a candle on days that feel worrisome to remind us that there is light in the world if we will look for it. Showing compassion seems like an obvious one, but sometimes we feel worn out or feel as if we're out of compassion. When I get to points where I feel empty of compassion, I remind myself that I'm trying to do too much, and I invite myself to focus on one person or one action. And then I remember I still have some compassion left. That usually helps. The lies of the empire make us believe that we might have won the lottery, or that we might be the sole recipient of the will of a long-lost princess. We want to believe whatever it is that will make our lives a little bit easier, a little bit better, which is usually geared toward having more of something, a little more money, a little more access, a little more power. When empire thinking tends to strike at our hearts is when we begin feeling or experiencing or thinking we are living in and with scarcity. We saw this magnified in the early days of the pandemic, when things flew off the shelves because people were scared there wouldn't be any left for them. Toilet paper was one of the items that became scarce. But what we found out later was that there were people who were buying so much toilet paper all at once that it resulted in scarcity for others. When stores began putting a limit on the amount of toilet paper people could buy, it turned out there seemed to be enough. One of the biggest lies of the empire and one of the sharpest tools of white supremacy is that there is not enough, and so we must hoard and protect what we have if we're in the privileged class, or that we must fight against all others for scraps if we are in a minority group. On Tuesday, our own city council here in Chicago is going to vote on the Bring Chicago Home ordinance, which would result in a real estate transfer tax for properties that sell for more than $1 million in order to provide a steady stream of funding for those who are houseless. Real estate companies are rising up in opposition, saying it would hurt their business and it would hurt homeowners. Do you recognize that as a lie following several years of the most incredible profits in the real estate industry? Our daughter worked for Guaranteed Rate, whose headquarters are right here in Chicago. They are one of the biggest mortgage companies with close ties to real estate. Over the 7 years that she worked there, she made less money at the end, she worked longer hours, and had to do 2 to 3 jobs instead of just her own because of how many positions kept being cut. All this while the owners and big bosses were receiving huge bonuses, and the company was paying millions of dollars each year just to have their name on White Sox Stadium. We must discern the truth from the lies and continue to work on behalf of all those who are marginalized. When you hear scarcity, I want you to question it from all sides and every angle. Something is making the rich get richer, so the cries of scarcity should ring hollow for all of us. How we allocate resources and wealth is the truth we need to pursue. You'll be happy to know I have given up magical thinking, and I no longer believe I will win a lottery I have not entered. I have learned something over time. I hope you'll join me in the pursuit and articulation of truth.